Hey there. Today I wanted to talk about integrating Calendly into Google Analytics. So Calendly, if you don't know, is a meeting booking tool good for one-on-one meetings, and you can integrate it right into your website. Now, by default, Calendly does have a Google Analytics integration, but I don't recommend you use your main property. So you see here, I've got Juice Marketing. That's my main site, and I've set up a separate property for Calendly. All right. This is how I recommend you use the default integration. All right, you see here, we're in Calendly, Google Analytics information, and I'm using the -2 for the second property. And the reason that I recommend that you do this is that Calendly isn't closely integrated with Google Analytics. All right, and you see, we'll just look at a user journey to show what I mean. All right, so say someone comes by Google search. They go to your home page, they visit your services page, they visit a case study, and then on that case study page, Calendly has 5 events in their default integration that trigger on the way to booking a meeting. And so if someone books a meeting, you'll get your Calendly events. So this person had 3 page views and 5 Calendly events. So this is what actually happens. But what you see in analytics is not one user, but 2 users. All right, one user who comes via home services case study with 3 page views, and then another user who's a referral from your site, and that person will have all 5 Calendly events. And as an interesting side effect, they'll also have a not set landing page because there's no page. There's only events in this. So this default behavior, it's good if you set up separately and you want to look at how people interact with Calendly. So for example, if you have a link or any of the Calendly widgets on your website, and then you also have a link in the footer of your email, or you're sending out links using marketing automation. You have all these different ways that people book meetings with you. And you want to see how are people booking these meetings. Then this default setup where you're tagging all of your UTM parameters works really well. It's quite useful. But if you want to actually integrate your tracking so that you can see how people interact with your website and then convert on Calendly, this doesn't work. So what I'm going to go over is a way to set up Calendly so that it does track that conversion event. Now, by default, Calendly doesn't really have a way for you to do this. You can't pass your client ID that identifies the browser to Calendly, and it doesn't have a way of sending that information back to Google Analytics once you do. However, we can hack this together because Calendly does let you send UTM parameters, which I hope you're familiar with, and it also has an API that you can hook into most easily using Zapier, which is how we're going to do it here, and then point those conversion events back to your main Google Analytics property. So the first thing we're going to do is create a custom variable in Google Tag Manager. I've named it GA Client ID, and here's the code. Note all the codes in the accompanying blog post linked at the bottom in the description. Oh, basically what this does, custom JavaScript, get your Google Analytics tracker, return the tracker client ID. If there's no client ID, return NA, not applicable. And save that. And then we can have a look in Calendly. We're going to want to prepare the JavaScript. So this is the embed. I'm using a 15-minute meeting. do all the customization for the widget in here, then copy the code and well, not quite send it to the developer because we're going to modify it a bit. So here you can see this is my modified code, and on this side we've got the default code. So what you're going to do is you're going to add ID equals calendar, or whatever ID you prefer, but if you're following along and copying code, then calendar is going to be the easiest. And then you're going to grab this URL here, copy that, and then delete this line. So take that copied URL, paste it in, and you get Calendly's JavaScript code. We're going to need this later. So what this code does is it takes the URL from this data URL and the configuration parameters in the data URL, and it generates the actual Calendly widget. So what we need, we're going to modify this in Google Tag Manager to pass the UTM parameters, and specifically we're going to pass the UTM term because that's not often used. You only need that if you're driving pay-per-click traffic to your Calendly pages. And since I'm not doing that, and I think most of you are not, we're going to use UTM term and put our client ID there, and then when we go into Zapier, grab the API and through the API and map that the client ID stored in UTM term to a client ID in a measurement protocol hit that we're going to send back to the original property with an event showing the conversion. So copy all this, create a new custom HTML tag. I titled it Calendly script. Paste it all in here and hit save. Now you're gonna get an error for no firing trigger. That's fine. We don't want a firing trigger. So here we're gonna create another tag, and this one's gonna be custom HTML. And again, this code is in the description of the video. Copy and paste the code in here. Make sure you grab that data URL from the data URL from your Calendly script. Paste it in here, and then you're going to add an UTM term equals, and then this is putting in your Google Analytics client ID. So next, so this, if the element is matched, so calendar, get element by ID calendar, then change the data URL to this URL here with the client ID. And then under triggering, we want to trigger with page view window loaded because we want to wait till everything is ready, and then fire a tag after this trigger and use the Calendly script, because the Calendly script needs this URL with UTM term set to your Google Analytics client ID to be set up before it runs. If it runs first, then you're going to get our default value of not applicable, which we don't want. So really we should have everything set up now to get the client ID, Google Analytics client ID, into your app and web. So you see here, I've got my Google Analytics, I've got add UTM to Calendly, I've got Calendly script, and if we go and view source, and I look at where the modal has been set up, modal dialog, this is just my code, your code will be different, but in the you've got my div ID calendar, class inline widget, and the data URL. UTM term is equal to my client ID. So we've got this working. We've got the client ID into Calendly. The next step, and there are more difficult ways of doing this, but the easiest one is to use Zapier and create a Zap. So first, when there's an invitee created in Calendly, then run this Zap. That's your trigger. We want to have a filter. Only continue this if your tracking UTM term does not match not applicable, because we don't want to be sending NA as the client ID into Google Analytics. And then we want to create a measurement in Google Analytics. So we're going to send a event, account, property, carriages, event category. This can be hard-coded to what you want. Event action, set a meeting. Label is going to be their answer to the one question I have in my form. Event value, this is the lookup table, or you could just hard code a value. So I think I put 20 in the examples. And then custom client ID is the UTM term from Calendly. And then you can chain all kinds of other things, like adding them to your CRM, sending a message to Slack, or error message to Slack if there's an error in the process, or this is I'm not going to cover here, but for app and web, you can use this. The code is in the blog post, but you can grab the CID and value and actually send a measurement protocol manually. So the above was this was measurement protocol using the widget in Zapier, and that works with Universal Analytics. They don't have anything that works with app and web, so we did this manually. And so you can see the code in the companion blog piece. And so back in Google Analytics, here we're in the events top event, and we can see top event category meeting. We can see here's my first test meeting, event action set, event label, and that's the drop down from my event form, passed through Zapier into my all website data for my main website. And so that's doesn't give you all of the little details of the default where you can see people setting time, setting date, and all that, but it gets you the important one. It lets you see that somebody has completed that conversion event, and you can use this event then to set up conversions to take the analysis to another level. And that's it. It's working. Have a look at the companion blog piece if you want to walk through this, or hit me up on LinkedIn if you have any questions. Thank you.